alone or with several of my comrades, followed the Jews, because I had already concluded that one would never make headway in this manner. When no change was apparent, after the first shots, I bellowed loudly something like, "What's the point of this nonsense? Away with the rope!" Due to my shout, the entire formation came to a halt, including the Huis, who, as I remember, turned toward me quite perplexed. I shouted at them once again to the effect they were all armed, that the business with the rope was nonsense. Away with the rope! After my second call, the Jews let the rope drop, and the entire group was able to move forward as a normal column. I myself then returned to the schoolyard. Agitated and vexed, I immediately went into the school and drank a schnapps 15. As the columns of marching Jews reached the forest, they were separated by sex and sent to one of 3 collecting areas. Here they were ordered to undress. Women were allowed to keep their shifts. In some areas the men were totally naked. Elsewhere they were allowed to keep their underpants. Policemen in each area were appointed to collect clothing and valuables. They were warned that they would be searched afterward. The Jews approached with their bundles of clothing, which were laid on a pile, and searched. After depositing their valuables in a large container, or throwing them onto an open blanket, the Jews were made to lie face down, and wait once more, often for hours, while their exposed skin burned under the hot August sun. 16. The preponderance of testimony indicates that Lieutenant Gnade was a Nazi by conviction, and an anti-Semite. He was also unpredictable, affable and approachable at times, brutal and vicious at others. His worst traits became more pronounced under the influence of alcohol, and by all accounts that afternoon, in Lomacz, Gnade was drunk senseless. In Poland he, in feet, degenerated into a drunkard. 17. Gnade's increasing dependence on alcohol was not unusual in the battalion. As one non-drinking policeman noted, most of the other comrades drank so much solely because of the many shootings of Jews, for such a life was quite intolerable sober. 18. If Gnade's drinking was commonplace, the streak of sadism he began to display at Lomacz was not. The previous fell Gnade had put his men on the night train from Minsk to avoid becoming involved in the execution of the Jews he had brought there from Hamburg. At J6ZEF6W, he had not distinguished himself from his fellow officers with any especially sadistic behavior. All this changed in the forest outside Lomacz, as Gnade sought to entertain himself while waiting for the Jews to finish digging the grave. Even before the shooting began, First Lieutenant Gnade had personally picked out some 20 to 25 elderly Jews. They were exclusively men, with full beards. Gnade made the old men crawl on the ground in the area before die. Grave. Before he gave them the order to crawl, they had to undress. While the totally naked Jews crawled, First Lieutenant Gnade screamed to those around, "Where are my non-commissioned officers? Don't you have any clubs yet?" The non-commissioned officers went to the edge of the forest, fetched themselves clubs, and vigorously beat the Jews with them. 19. When preparations for the shooting were complete, Gnade began to chase Jews from the undressing areas to the grave. 20. In small groups, the Jews were forced to run between a thin cordon of guards, some 30 to 50 meters, from the undressing areas to the grave. 21. The grave itself had mounds of dirt piled high on 3 sides. The 4th side was an incline, down which the Jews were driven. In their state of intoxicated excitement, the Huis initially began shooting the Jews at the entry to the grave. As a result, the Jews killed first blocked the slope. Thus some Jews went into the grave and pulled the corpses away from the entry. Immediately large numbers of Jews were driven into the grave, and the Huis took their positions on the walls that had been thrown up. From there they shot the victims. 22. As the shooting continued, the grave began to fill. The Jews who followed had to climb on, and later even clamber, over those shot earlier, because the grave was filled with corpses almost to the edge. 23. The Huis, often with bottle in hand, as well as Gnade and the SS officer, became increasingly drunk. 24. While First Lieutenant Gnade shot with his pistol from the dirt wall, whereby he was in constant danger of falling into the grave, the SD (sick) officer climbed into the grave just like the Huis, and shot from there, because he was so drunk, he could no longer stand on the wall. Groundwater mixed with blood began to rise in the grave, so that the Huis were soon standing in it, over their knees. The number of shooters steadily diminished as one by one, the Huis fell into a drunken stupor. Nate and the SS officer then began to scream reproaches at one another loudly enough to be heard by everyone standing within 30 meters of the grave. The SS officer yelled, "Your shit, police, don't shoot at all." Nate retorted, "Good, then my men will have to shoot too." 25 Lieutenants Drucker and Shear summoned their NCOs and passed on the order to form firing squads and carry out the executions in the same way as the Hewis. According to Sergeant Hergert, the NCOs rejected the Hewis methods because the groundwater already stood more than half a meter. Moreover, corpses already lay, to be more precise, floated all over the grave area. I remember as especially horrifying that large numbers of the Jews who were shot had not been fatally hit during the execution, and nonetheless were covered by the following victims, without being given mercy shots. 26. The NCOs decided that the execution should continue with 2 firing squads on opposite sides of the grave. The Jews were forced to lie down in rows along each side of the grave and were shot by the police standing on the opposite wall. Men from all 3 platoons were formed into squads of 8 to 10 and were relieved by others in rotation after 5 or 6 shots. After about 2 hours, the Hewis were roused from their stupor and resumed shooting in place of the German policemen. The shooting was finished around 7 p.m., and the work Jews who had been kept aside covered the grave. The work Jews were then shot as well. 27. The thin covering of the overfilled grave continued to move. 28. 1st and 2nd platoons returned to their stations that evening, but Gruppe Beckemeyer remained in Lomazzi. A few days later, it carried out a sweep of the Jewish quarter. Searching the cellars and looking for bunkers dug under the floorboards of the houses, the policemen seized another 20 to 30 Jews. Beckemeyer telephoned Nade, who ordered shooting. Accompanied by 3 or 4 Polish policemen, Beckemeyer and his men took the Jews to the edge of the forest, forced them to lie down, and shot them in the neck from behind, once again using the bayonet as an aiming guide. Each man shot at least once, some twice. The Polish mayor was ordered to bury the bodies. 29. The massacre at Lomazzi, the second 4-figure shooting, carried out by the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, differed from the massacre at J6ZEF-6W in significant ways. On the part of the victims, there seem to have been many more escape attempts. At Lomazzi, 30 presumably because the young, able-bodied work Jews were not spared, and the victims were more aware of their impending fate from the beginning. Despite greater efforts by the Jews to hide or escape, in terms of efficiency, the killing procedure was a considerable advance over the improvised and amateurish methods employed at J6ZEF-6W. Roughly 1/3 as many men killed even more Jews, 1,700, in about half the time. Moreover, valuables and clothing were collected, and the bodies disposed of in a mass grave. Psychologically, the burden on the killers was much reduced. The Hewis, not just liquored up after the event to help them forget but drunk from the start, did most of the shooting. According to Sergeant Bentheim, his men were overjoyed that they were not required to shoot this time. 31. Those spared such direct participation seem to have had little if any sense of participation in the killing. After J6ZEF-6W, the roundup and guarding of Jews to be killed by someone else seemed relatively innocuous. Even the policemen, who did have to replace the Hewis and shoot for several hours in the late afternoon, did not recall the experience with anything like the horror that predominated in their accounts of J6ZEF-6W. This time the men did not have to pair off with their victims face to face. The personal tie between victim and killer was severed. In sharp contrast to J6ZEF-6W, only one policeman recalled the identity of a particular Jew he had shot. 32. In addition to the depersonalization of the killing process, through rapid rotation, the men were spared the sense of unremitting, endless killing that had been so salient at J6ZEF-6W. Their direct participation in the killing was not only less personal, but more finite. Habituation played a role as well. Having killed once already, the men did not experience such a traumatic shock the second time. Like much else, killing was something one could get used to. One other factor sharply distinguished Lomzi from J6ZEF6W and may well have been yet another land of psychological relief for the men, namely, this time they did not bear the burden of choice that Trap had offered them so starkly on the occasion of the first massacre. No chance to step out was given to those who did not feel up to shooting. No one systematically excused those who were visibly too shaken to continue. Everyone assigned to the firing squads took his turn as ordered. 33 Therefore, those who shot did not have to live with the clear awareness that what they had done had been avoidable. This is not to say that the men had no choice, only that it was not offered to them so openly and explicitly as at J6ZEF6W. They had to exert themselves to evade killing. Even Sergeant Hergert, who was most emphatic that there was no call for volunteers and that virtually every man in the company had to take a turn at shooting, conceded that some men may have slipped off into the woods. 34 Apparently the number of evaders was quite small, however, for in contrast to J6ZEF6W, only 2 men testified to having deliberately avoided shooting in some way. Sorg Kageler claimed to have been part of a group that had twice escorted Jews from Lomzi to the forest and then more or less slipped away to escape a further assignment. 35 Paul Metzger * was assigned to an outer cordon at the edge of the forest to block Jews who bolted from the undressing areas and ran for their lives. At J6ZEF6W, Metzger had slipped off among the trucks after 2 rounds of shooting. Now at Lomzi, when one fleeing Jew suddenly ran toward him, Metzger let him pass. As he recalled, First Lieutenant Nade, who was already drunk by then, wanted to know which sentry had allowed the Jew to run away. I did not report myself, and none of my comrades reported. Because of his drunkenness, First Lieutenant Nade was unable to investigate the matter, and so I was not held to account. The actions of Kageler and Metzger involved at least some risk, but neither suffered any consequence for his evasion. Most of the policemen, however, seemed to have made no effort to avoid shooting. At Lomzi, following orders reinforced the natural tendency to conform to the behavior of one's comrades. This was much easier to bear than the situation at J6ZEF6W, where the policemen were allowed to make personal decisions concerning their participation, but the cost of not shooting was to separate themselves from their comrades, and to expose themselves as weak. Trap had not only offered a choice, but he had set a tone. We have the task to shoot Jews, but not to beat or torture them, he had declared. 37 His own personal distress had been apparent to all at J6ZEF6W. Thereafter, however, most Jewish actions were carried out in company and platoon strength, not by the full battalion. The company commanders, like Nade at Lomzi, and not Trap, were thus in a position to set the tone for the behavior expected and encouraged from the men. Nade's gratuitous and horrific sadism at the grave's edge was only one instance of how he chose to exercise leadership in this regard, but such examples soon multiplied. When Nade and the SS commander of the Trauonicus, both still drunk, encountered Tony Bentham in the Lomzi schoolyard after the massacre, Nade asked, "Well, how many did you shoot then?" When the sergeant replied none, Nade responded contemptuously, "One can't expect otherwise, you're Catholic after all." 38 With such leadership, and the help of the Trauonicus at Lomzi, the men of 2nd Company took a major step toward becoming hardened killers. The August deportations to Treblinka, far from any railway station, Lomzi was a town in which Jews had been concentrated in June 1942, but from which they could not be easily deported. Hence the massacre of August 17. Most of the Jews in the northern Lublin district, however, resided in the towns of Rajiri, LUK6W, Perchu, and Mijirzik, all proximate to rail connections. Henceforth the major contribution of Reserve Police Battalion 101 to the final solution was no longer local massacre, but ghetto clearing and deportation to the extermination camp at Treblinka, located some 110 kilometers to the north of the battalion headquarters in Rajiri. The first deportation train to Treblinka left Warsaw late on July 22, 1942, and reached the extermination camp the following morning. Thereafter Jewish transports from Warsaw and the surrounding district arrived daily. Between August 5th and August 24th, some 30,000 Jews of Rodham and Kielce were also shipped to Treblinka. Though the camp's killing capacity was stretched to the breaking point, Glaboknik impatiently decided to commence deportations from northern Lublin as well. The Jews of Parsiu and Mijierzyk, in the county of Rajiri, at the center of Reserve Police Battalion 101's security zone, were the first targets. Steinmetz's 3rd Platoon of 2nd Company, minus Gruppe Beckemeyer, which had been detached to Lomazy, was stationed in Parsiu. More than 5,000 Jews lived in the city's Jewish quarter, which was not separated from the rest of the town by either wire or wall. But the lack of a sealed ghetto did not mean that the Jewish community there had not suffered all the usual discrimination and humiliation of the German occupation. As Steinmetz recalled, when his policemen arrived, the main street was already paved with Jewish gravestones. In early August, some 300 to 500 Jews in Parsiu had been loaded onto horse-drawn wagons and driven 5 or 6 kilometers into the woods under police guard. There the Jews had been turned over to a unit of SS men. The policemen left before hearing any shots, and the fate of the Jews remained unknown to them. 2 rumors of a much larger deportation circulated in Parsiu, and many Jews fled to the woods. 3 most were still in town. However, when policemen of the 1st and 2nd Companies of Reserve Police Battalion 101, along with a unit of Huis, descended upon Parsiu early on August 19, just 2 days after the Lomazy massacre, Trapp gave another speech, informing the men that the Jews were to be taken to the train station, 2 or 3 kilometers out of town. He indicated indirectly, but without ambiguity, that once again the old and frail who could not march were to be shot on the spot. 2nd Company set up the cordon, and 1st Company carried out the search action in the Jewish quarter. 5 by afternoon, a long column of Jews stretched from the marketplace to the train station. About 3,000 of Parsiu's Jews were deported that day. Several days later, this time without the help of any Huis, the entire operation was repeated, and the remaining 2,000 Jews of Parsiu were sent to Treblinka as well. 6 In the policemen's memories, the Parsiu deportations were relatively uneventful. Everything went smoothly, there was little shooting, and the participation of the Huis in the first deportation does not seem to have been marked by their usual drunkenness and brutality. Presumably because so little dirty work needed to be done, the Huis were not even deemed necessary for the second deportation. While the policemen did not know precisely where the Jews were being sent or what was to be done with them, it was clear and well known to us all as Heinrich Steinmetz admitted that for the Jews affected, these deportations meant the path to death. We suspected that they would be killed in some sort of camp. 7 Spared direct participation in the killing. The men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 seem scarcely to have been disturbed by this awareness, even though there were more victims in the Parsiu deportations than in the J6ZEF, 6W and Lomazy massacres combined. Out of sight was truly out of mind. Indeed, for some men of Steinmetz's platoon, the most vivid memory was that they were assigned guard duty in a swampy meadow north of Parsiu, where they had to stand all day with wet feet. 8 Far more memorable for Reserve Police Battalion 101 was the deportation of 11,000 Jews from Mijierzyk to Treblinka on August 25 to 26. 9 In August 1942, Mijierzyk was the largest ghetto in the county of Rajii, with a Jewish population of more than 12,000, in comparison to 10,000 Jews in LUK 6W and 6,000 in the town of Rajii. In June 1942, ghetto administration in the Lublin district had been transferred from the civil authorities to the SS, and these 3 ghettos were henceforth supervised by men dispatched from the Rajii branch office of the security police. 10 Like Izbiku and Pieski, in the south of the Lublin district, Mijierzyk was destined to become a transit ghetto, in which Jews from the surrounding region were collected and sent to Treblinka. To receive more Jews from elsewhere, the ghetto in Mikyrzec had to be periodically emptied of its inhabitants. The first and largest such clearing took place on August 25 to 26 in a combined action of 1st Company, 3rd Platoon of 2nd Company, and 1st Platoon of 3rd Company from Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of Huis, and the Rajiri Security Police. 11 When the battalion headquarters moved from Belgrade to Rajiri in late July, the men of 1st Company were stationed there as well as in Kok, LUK 6W, and KOMAR 6WKA. 1st Platoon of 3rd Company was also stationed in the county of Rajiri, in the town of Chemerniki, and 3rd Platoon of 2nd Company, in Perchu. These 5 platoons were now mobilized for the MI-DZYRZEC action. Some of the policemen arrived in Mijayarzik on the night of August 24th, one unit accompanying a convoy of wagons bringing additional Jews. 12 Most of the men, however, assembled in Rajiri in the early hours of August 25th under the supervision of 1st Sergeant Kammer. The initial absence of Captain Wolof was explained when the convoy of trucks stopped in front of his private residence on the way out of town. Wolof and his young bride, 4 months pregnant, with a military coat draped over her shoulders and a peaked military cap on her head, emerged from the house and climbed aboard one of the trucks. While Captain Wolof sat up front next to the driver, one policeman recalled, "I now had to give up my seat to make room for his wife." 13 Prior to joining Reserve Police Battalion 101, Captain Wolof had experienced several career difficulties. He had been sent to Norway with Police Battalion 105 in April 1940, but his commander there eventually demanded his recall. Wolof was energetic and bright, he noted, but lacked all discipline, and was much too impressed with himself. 14 Sent back to Hamburg, Wolof was judged by his next commander as lacking interest in home front service, and requiring strict supervision. 15 At this point, in the spring of 1941, Wolof was assigned to Police Battalion 101, which had just returned from L6DZ, and his professional fortunes changed. Within months the new battalion commander, Trapp, recommended him for promotion and a company command. Wolof was soldierly, energetic, full of life, and possessed leadership qualities, Trapp wrote. Moreover, he sought to act on National Socialist principles, and instructed his men accordingly. He was ready at any time, without reservation, to go the limit for the National Socialist state. 16 Wolof was promoted to the rank of captain, took over 1st Company, and became Trapp's deputy commander. To the men, Wolof seemed quite pretentious. One policeman remembered that Wolof rode standing in his car, like a general. Another remarked that he was disparagingly called the Little Rommel. 17 The chief clerk of 1st Company recalled his energy, his determination to take charge of all aspects of his command, and his ability to get things done. 18 His reluctant platoon commander, Lieutenant Buchmann, judged him a much more upright and genuine person than Lieutenant Nade, admittedly a not very high standard of comparison, and not a prominent anti-Semite. He was an officer who took his responsibilities seriously, but above all he was a young man just married, and consumed in romance. 19 Indeed, the sudden departure of Reserve Police Battalion 101 for Poland had caught Wolof by surprise, upsetting plans for a June 22nd wedding. No sooner had he arrived in Tigray in late June than he beseeched Trapp to let him return briefly to Hamburg to marry his girlfriend, because she was already pregnant. At first Trapp refused, but then granted him a special leave. Wolof was married on June 29 and returned to Poland just in time for J6ZEF6W. Once his company was stationed in Rajiri, Wolof had his new bride visit him there for their honeymoon. 20 Wolof may have brought his bride along to witness the Mijayarzik deportation, because he could not stand to be separated from her in the fresh bloom of their honeymoon, as Buchmann suggested. On the other hand, the pretentious and self-important captain may have been trying to impress his new bride by showing her he was master over the life and death of Polish Jewry. The men clearly thought the latter, and their reaction was uniformly one of indignation and outrage that a woman was brought to witness the terrible things they were doing. 21 The men of 1st Company, if not their captain, could still feel shame. When the convoy carrying Wolof, his bride, and most of 1st Company arrived in Mijayarzik, less than 30 kilometers to the north of Rajiri, the action was already underway. The men could hear shooting and screaming as the Huis and security police had begun the roundup. The men waited while Wolof went off to get instructions. 20 or 30 minutes later, he returned and issued the company assignments. Some men were sent to outer guard duty, but most of them were assigned to the clearing action, alongside the Huis. The usual orders were given to shoot anyone trying to escape, as well as the sick, old, and frail who could not march to the train station, just outside town. 22 While the men waited for Wolof's return, they encountered a security police officer, already quite drunk. Despite the early hour 23, it was soon apparent that the Huis were also drunk. 24 They shot so often, and so wildly that the policemen frequently had to take cover to avoid being hit. 25 The policemen saw the corpses of Jews, who had been shot everywhere in the streets and houses. Driven by the Huis and policemen, thousands of Jews streamed into the marketplace. Here they had to sit or squat without moving or getting up. As the hours passed on this very hot August day of the late summer heat wave, many Jews fainted and collapsed. Moreover, beating and shooting continued in the marketplace. 27 Having removed her military coat as the temperature rose, Frau Wolof was clearly visible in her dress on the marketplace, watching the events at close range. 28 About 2 p.m. the outer guard was called to the marketplace, and 1 or 2 hours later the march to the train station began. The entire force of Huis and policemen was employed to drive the thousands of Jews along the route. Once again, shooting was common. The footsick, who could go no farther, were shot and left lying on the side of the road. Corpses lined the street to the train station. 29 One final horror was reserved to the end, for the train cars now had to be loaded. While the Huis and security police packed 120 to 140 Jews into each car, the reserve policemen stood guard and observed. As one remembered, when it didn't go well, they made use of riding whips and guns. The loading was simply frightful. There was an unearthly cry from these poor people, because 10 or 20 cars were being loaded simultaneously. The entire freight train was dreadfully long. One could not see all of it. It may have been 50 to 60 cars, if not more. After a car was loaded, the doors were closed and nailed shut. 30 Once all the cars were sealed, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 quickly departed without waiting to see the train pull away. The clearing of the Mejrzik ghetto was the largest deportation operation the battalion would carry out during its entire participation in the final solution. Only 1,000 Jews in Mejrzik had been given temporary work permits to remain in the ghetto until they could be replaced with Poles. 31, thus some 11,000 were targeted for deportation. The policemen knew that many hundreds of Jews were shot in the course of the operation, but of course they did not know exactly how many. 32 The surviving Jews who collected and buried the bodies did know, however, and their count was 96033. This figure needs to be put into some wider perspective in order to show the ferocity of the Mejrzik deportation, even by the Nazi standards of 1942. About 300,000 Jews were deported from Warsaw between July 22 and September 21, 1942. The total number of Jews killed by gunfire over this 2-month period was recorded as 34 in Warsaw. Therefore, the ratio between those killed on the spot and those deported was approximately 2%. The same ratio for Mejrzik was nearly 9%. The Jews of Mejrzik did not march like sheep to the slaughter. They were driven with an almost unimaginable ferocity and brutality that left a singular imprint even on the memories of the increasingly numbed and callous participants from Reserve Police Battalion 101. This was no case of out of sight, out of mind. Why the contrast between the relatively uneventful and hence unmemorable deportations from Purchu and the horror of Mejrzik only 1 week later? On the German side, the key factor was the ratio between perpetrators and victims. For the more than 5,000 Jews of Purchu, the Germans had 2 companies of order police and a unit of Huis, or 300 to 350 men. For Mejrzik, with twice the number of Jews to be deported, the Germans used 5 platoons of order police, the local security police, and a unit of Huis, or 350 to 400 men. The greater the pressure on the German ghetto clearers, in terms of manpower, the greater their ferocity and brutality to get the job done. Globoknik's impatient attempt to commence deportations to Treblinka from northern Lublin, simultaneous with those from the districts of Warsaw and Radom, proved too much for the capacity of the extermination camp. In late August, the number of Jews waiting to be killed and the number of corpses that could not be disposed of quickly enough piled up. The overburdened killing machinery broke down. The deportations throughout the Warsaw, Radom, and Lublin districts were temporarily halted, including a train scheduled for 2 trips from LUK6W to Treblinka, beginning August 28. 35 Globoknik and his extermination camp supervisor, Christian Wirth, rushed to Treblinka to reorganize the camp. Franz Stangl was summoned from SOBIB6R, which was relatively inactive, while rail line repairs made it inaccessible to all but nearby sites, and named commandant. After a week of reorganization, deportations from Warsaw to Treblinka resumed on September 3, followed by deportations from the Radom district in mid-September. Meanwhile, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 enjoyed a brief respite, for only in late September did the killing resume in northern Lublin. Late September shootings, shortly before the deportation program resumed in the northern security zone of the Lublin district. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was involved in several more mass shootings. The first of these occurred in the village of Sarakomla, some 9 kilometers northwest of Kok. Sarakomla had already experienced one massacre in May 1940 at the hands of ethnic Germans, organized into vigilante-style units known as the Selbstschutz, self-defense. These units had been created in occupied Poland in the fall of 1939 and the spring of 1940 under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler's Colonel Ludolf von Alvensleben. After conducting a series of massacres, including one at Sarakomla, the Selbstschutz was reorganized into special Vice units known as the Sonderdienst and placed under the local county heads of the civil administration. One Sarakomla was visited again by the Germans in September 1942. Lieutenant Brand's platoon of 1st Company was stationed in nearby Kok. Brand ordered Sergeant Hans Keller and 10 men of the platoon to round up Jews in the outlying areas around Sarakomla and bring them to the village. Then, early on the morning of September 22, Brand's platoon drove out of Kok and waited at a crossroads northwest of town. They were joined by other units of 1st Company, under Captain Wolof, arriving from Rajiri 20 kilometers to the northeast, as well as the 1st Platoon of 3rd Company, under Lieutenant Peters, which was stationed in Chemerniki 15 kilometers to the east. Under the command of Captain Wolof, the reserve policemen drove to Sarakomla. Shortly before reaching the village, Wolof halted the convoy and gave orders. Machine guns were set up on 2 hills just outside the town, vantage points from which the entire area could be seen. Some men from Brand's platoon were assigned to cordon off the Jewish quarter of the village, and the rest of 1st Company was detailed to collect the Jewish population. 3 As yet Wolof had said nothing about shooting, except that the men were to proceed, as usual, an indirect reference, understood to mean that those attempting to hide or escape as well as those unable to walk were to be shot on the spot. However, Lieutenant Peters's platoon, which had been held in reserve, was sent to an area of gravel pits and mounds of waste material, less than a kilometer outside the village. To Sergeant Keller, who could observe the deployment from his machine gun nests atop the 2 nearby hills, it was obvious that the Jews of Sarakomla were going to be shot, though Wolof had only spoken to the men of resettlement. The collection of the Jews of Sarakomla, some 200 or 300, was completed by 11 a.m. on what was turning out to be a warm, sunny day. Then Wolof suddenly declared that all the Jews were to be shot. 4 additional men from 1st Company were sent to the gravel pits under the command of Sergeant Jurek * to join the shooters from Lieutenant Peters's platoon. At around noon, the remaining men of 1st Company began marching the Jews out of town in groups of 20 to 30. Lieutenant Peters's platoon had been in the cordon at J6ZEF-6W and was thus spared duty in the firing squads. They had likewise been absent from 2nd Company's shooting at Lomazy. At Sarakomla, however, their turn had come. Without the experienced help of the Huis, as at Lomazy, Wolof organized the executions along the lines of the J6ZEF-6W shooting. The groups of 20 to 30 Jews, which had been marched out of town in succession to the gravel pits, were turned over to an equal number of Peters's and Jurich's commandos. Thus each policeman once again faced the individual Jew he was going to shoot. The Jews were not forced to undress, nor was there a collection of valuables. There was also no selection for labor. All the Jews, regardless of age and sex, were to be shot. The policemen in the shooting commandos marched their Jews to the crest of one of the mounds of waste material in the area of the gravel pits. The victims were lined up facing a 6-foot drop. From a short distance behind, the policemen fired on order into the necks of the Jews. The bodies tumbled over the edge. Following each round, the next group of Jews was brought to the same spot and thus had to look down at the growing pile of corpses of their family and friends before they were shot in turn. Only after a number of rounds did the shooters change sights. As the shooting proceeded, Sergeant Keller strolled down from his machine gun nests to talk with Sergeant Jurich. While they watched the shooting at close range, Jurich complained about Wolf. After the captain had ordered this sheet, he had sneaked off to Sarakamla and was sitting in the Polish police station. 5. Unable to show off to his new bride, who this time did not travel with him, Wolf apparently had no desire to be present at the killing. Subsequently, Wolf claimed that he did not have even the faintest memory of the Sarakamla action. Perhaps his mind was already on his upcoming trip to Germany to take his bride home. The shooting lasted until 3 p.m. Nothing was done about burial. The bodies of the dead Jews were simply left lying in the gravel pits. The policemen stopped in Koch, where they had an afternoon meal. When they returned to their respective lodgings that evening, they were given special rations of alcohol. 3 days after the massacre at Sarakamla, Sergeant Jobst of 1st Company, dressed in civilian clothes and accompanied by a single Polish translator, departed from Koch for a rendezvous that had been arranged to entrap a member of the Polish resistance who was in hiding between the villages of Sarakamla and Talsin. The trap was successfully sprung, and Jobst captured his man. However, as Jobst was returning to Koch through Talsin, he was ambushed and killed. The Polish interpreter escaped and reached Koch long after dark, with news of the sergeant's death. 7 Around midnight, Sergeant Jurich telephoned battalion headquarters in Rajiri to report the killing of Jobst. 8 When Keller talked with Jurich following the call, he got the impression that there was no inclination in battalion headquarters to punish the village. Major Trapp soon called back from Rajiri, however, and said that Lublin had ordered a retaliation shooting of 200 people. 9 The same units that had descended upon Sarakamla 4 days earlier now met at the same crossroads outside Koch early on the morning of September 26. Captain Wolf was not in command this time, for he was already on his way to Germany. Instead, Major Trapp, accompanied by his adjutant, Lieutenant Hagen, and the battalion staff, was personally in charge. Upon arrival in Talsin, the entire 1st Company was shown the body of Sergeant Jobst, which had been left lying in the street on the edge of town. 10 The town was sealed, and the Polish inhabitants were fetched from their homes and collected in the school. Many of the men had already fled the village. 11 But the remaining males were brought to the school gymnasium, where Trapp proceeded to carry out a selection. Obviously anxious to alienate the local population as little as possible, Trapp and Lieutenant Hagen made the selection in consultation with the Polish mayor. Only 2 categories of Poles were involved: strangers and temporary residents in Talsin, on the one hand, and those without sufficient means of existence, on the other. 12 Trapp sent at least 1 policeman to calm the women being held in nearby classrooms, who were crying and screaming in desperation. 13 78 Polish men were selected by this process. They were taken outside of town and shot. As one German policeman recalled, they shot only the poorest of the poor. 14 Lieutenant Buchmann took some of the men directly back to Rajiri, but others stopped in Koch for lunch. They were in the middle of their meal when they learned that the killing for the day was not yet over. Still far short of his retaliation quota of 200, Trapp had apparently hit upon an ingenious way to meet it without further aggravating relations with the local population. Instead of shooting more Poles in Telsin, his policemen would shoot Jews from the Kot ghetto. 15. German policeman, a driver who was on his way to Rajzai, claimed that he stopped at the ghetto on the edge of town to warn of the imminent action. 16 such warnings, of course, were to no avail for a trapped population. Search squads of German police entered the ghetto and proceeded to grab anyone they could find, regardless of age or sex. Older Jews who could not march to the shooting site were gunned down on the spot. One policeman later testified, "Although I was supposed to take part in the search, here too I was able to mill around the streets. I disapproved of the Jewish actions in any form, and thus did not deliver a single Jew to be shot." 17 As usual, though, the few who shirked or evaded participation did not impede those intent upon their task. The Jews who had been caught in the dragnet were taken out of the ghetto to a large house that backed onto a walled courtyard. In groups of 30, they were led into the courtyard and forced to lie down next to the wall. On the order of Lieutenant Brand, the Jews were shot by non-commissioned officers, equipped with submachine guns. The bodies were left lying until the next day, when work Jews from the ghetto were fetched to bury their dead in a mass grave. 18 Major Trapp immediately reported to Lublin that 3 bandits, 78 Polish accomplices, and 180 Jews had been executed in retaliation for the ambush of Jobst in Telsin. 19 Apparently the man who had wept through the massacre at J6ZEFOW and still shied from the indiscriminate slaughter of Poles no longer had any inhibitions about shooting more than enough Jews to meet his quota. If Major Trapp was reconciling himself to his role in the murder of Polish Jewry, Lieutenant Buchman was not. After J6ZEF6W, he had informed Trapp that without a direct personal order, he would not take part in Jewish actions. He had also asked for a transfer. In making such requests, Buchman had an important advantage. Before being sent to officer training and becoming a reserve lieutenant, Buchman had been a driver for Trapp during the battalion's first stint in Poland in 1939. He thus knew Trapp personally. He felt that Trapp understood him and was not indignant about the position he took. 20 Trapp did not obtain an immediate transfer for Buchman back to Germany, but he did protect him and accommodate his request not to participate in Jewish actions. Buchman was stationed in Rajiri, in the same building as the battalion staff, so it was not difficult to work out a procedure that avoided any refusal to obey orders. Whenever a Jewish action was planned, orders were passed directly from headquarters to Buchman's deputy, Sergeant Grund. When Grund would ask Buchman if he wished to accompany the platoon on its forthcoming action, Buchman knew that it was a Jewish action, and declined. Thus he had not gone with 1st Company to either Mijierzyk or Sarakamla. Telsin did not begin as a Jewish action, however, and Buchman was in the school when Trapp carried out the selection of the Poles, though it was no accident that Trapp sent him directly back to Rajzi 6 before the killing of Jews from the Kot ghetto began. In Rajiri, Buchman had made no effort to hide his feelings. On the contrary, he was indignant about how the Jews were treated, and openly expressed these views at every opportunity. 21 It was obvious to those around him that Buchman was a very reserved, refined man, a typical civilian, who had no desire to be a soldier. 22 For Buchman, Telsin was the final straw. On the afternoon he returned, the desk clerk tried to report to him, but he had immediately gone to his room and locked himself in. For days Buchman would not talk to me, although we knew each other well. He was very angry, and complained bitterly, saying something to the effect, "Now I won't do this shit any longer. I have a nose full." Buchman not only complained. In late September he also wrote directly to Hamburg, urgently requesting a transfer. He could not carry out those tasks alien to the police that his unit was being given in Poland. 24 If Buchman's behavior was tolerated and protected by Trapp, it received mixed reactions from his men. Among my subordinates many understood my position, but others made disparaging remarks about me, and looked down their noses at me. 25 A few men in the ranks followed his example, however, and told the company first sergeant, Kammer, that they were neither able nor willing to take part in such actions anymore. Kammer did not report them. Instead he yelled at them, calling them shitheads, who were good for nothing. But for the most part, he freed them from participating in further Jewish actions. 26 In so doing, Kammer was following the example Trapp had set from the beginning. As long as there was no shortage of men willing to do the murderous job at hand, it was much easier to accommodate Buchmann and the men who emulated him than to make trouble over them. The deportations resume. By the end of September 1942, Reserve Police Battalion 101 had participated in the shooting of approximately 4,600 Jews and 78 Poles and had helped deport approximately 15,000 Jews to the extermination camp at Treblinka. These murderous activities had involved 8 separate actions, stretched over 3 months. On 3 occasions, the first deportation from Purchu, the shooting at Lomazy, and the deportation from Mijierzyk, the policemen had worked alongside Huey units from Troniki. On the other 5J6ZEFOW, the second Purchu deportation, Sarakamla-Talsin, and Koch, the policemen had worked alone. The policemen were able to keep these actions distinct in their memories. They could describe each, in some detail and date them fairly precisely. Between the beginning of October and early November, however, the activities of Reserve Police Battalion 101 intensified greatly. One action followed another, in unremitting succession, as tens of thousands of Jews were deported from the county of Radzin, in repeated ghetto-clearing operations. It is therefore very difficult to reconstruct the events of these deadly 6 weeks. The policemen's memories, blurred as one action ran into another. They could still recall some particular incidents, but could no longer fit them into a chronological sequence of distinct operations. My reconstruction of this rapid sequence of events, to which the confused memories of the policemen must be matched, is based above all upon the immediate post-war research of the Polish Jewish historian Tatiana Brustin-Berenstein and the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. 1 In early September, the disposition of order police in the Lublin district was modified. A 4th security zone was created, which included the 3 counties Biafy Podlaska, Hrubieszcz6W, and Chen along the district's eastern border. This permitted the transfer of the 1st and 2nd platoons of NADE's 2nd Company from the county of Biafy Podlaska to the towns of Mikrzyrzec and Komar6WKA in northern Radzin County. 2 In the last week of September, most of the remaining Jews in Biafy Podlaska followed 2nd Company. They were rounded up and transferred to the now nearly empty ghetto in Mikrzyrzec. 3 The Mikrzyrzec transit ghetto was also restocked in September and October from towns in the county of Radzidi, directly from Komrauka as well as from Wołyn and Chemierniki via Purchu. 4 of all these transfers, the policemen remembered only the one from Komrauka, where 2nd platoon of 2nd Company was regularly stationed. 5 Among the Jews in Komar6WKA was a woman from Hamburg, who had formerly owned a movie theater, the Millarder Kino, that one of the policemen had frequented. 6 The ghetto at LUK6W served as a second transit ghetto, receiving Jews from other small towns in the county of Radzin. 7 This process of concentration was of course an ominous prelude to the renewed death transports to Treblinka and the systematic campaign to make the northern Lublin district Judenfrei 7 or free of Jews. The coordinating center for the October offensive against the ghettos of Radzai County was the branch office of the security police under Untersturmführer Fritz Fischer. Administration of the Radzin, Lukau, and Mijierzyk ghettos had been taken over by security police officers in June 1942, but local manpower was quite limited. The Radzin branch office and its outpost in Lukau had perhaps a total of 40 German security police and ethnic German helpers between them. Fischer also had a permanent unit of 20 Huis at his disposal. Mijierzyk, LUK6W, and Radzai had a total of 40 to 50 gendarmerie. 9 Clearly, this limited force of security police and gendarmerie, even with Fischer's own Huey unit, was utterly dependent on outside help for deporting the Jews from these ghettos. Once again, Reserve Police Battalion 101 provided the bulk of the manpower, without which the ghetto clearing could never have been carried out. The deportations to Treblinka resumed on October 1st, when 2,000 Jews were shipped from the ghetto of Rajzin. On October 5th 5,000 Jews, and on October 8th a further 2,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka from LUK6W. In a parallel action, thousands of Jews were deported from Mijayerzyk on October 6th and 9. Presumably the trains from LUK6W and Mijayerzyk were joined after loading, though no witnesses testified to this effect. Between October 14th and 16, the clearing of the Rajzin ghetto was completed by transferring its 2,000 to 3,000 Jews to Mijayerzyk. Their stay was brief, for Jews were deported from Mijayerzyk again on October 27th and November 7th. On November 6th, the 700 remaining Jews in Kok were taken to LUK6W. The following day, as the ghetto in Mijayerzyk was also being cleared, 3,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka from LUK6W10. Interspersed with the deportations were occasional shootings, to liquidate those Jews who had successfully evaded the ghetto clearing, by hiding or had been deliberately left behind either for lack of space in the trains, or to work in cleanup details. When the 6-week onslaught was over, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 had helped deport more than 27,000 Jews to Treblinka in 8 actions and had killed perhaps 1,000 more during the roundups, and in at least 4 mopping up shootings. What the policemen remembered about each of these actions varied tremendously. The opening operation, the deportation of 2,000 Jews from Rajiri on October 1st, was carried out jointly by men from 1st Company and 20 Huis, under Untersturmführer Fischer. There was apparently little killing on the spot, though the Huis fired frequent warning shots to drive the Jews to the train station. 11 The following day, October 2nd, Sergeant Steinmetz's 3rd Platoon of 2nd Company completed the liquidation of the Perchu ghetto by shooting, on Nade's orders, more than 100 Jews who had apparently been brought there too late for the transfer to Mijayerzyk. 12 Thereafter simultaneous deportations were carried out from the 2 transit ghettos in LUK6W and Mijayerzyk by 1st and 2nd Companies respectively. Since early September, Lieutenant Nade had made his new company headquarters in Mijayerzyk. To avoid the difficult Polish pronunciation, the men of 2nd Company referred to it by the German nickname Menschenschreck, or human horror. Nade's driver, Alfred Heilmann * remembered taking the lieutenant one evening to a 5-hour meeting in a building on the main square in Mijayerzyk that served as the security police headquarters and prison. During the meeting, a terrible cry arose from the cellar. 2 or 3 SS officers came out of the building and emptied their submachine guns through the cellar windows. "So now we'll have quiet," one remarked as they re-entered the building. Heilmann cautiously approached the cellar window, but the stench was terrible, and he turned back. The noise from upstairs increased until Nade emerged at midnight quite drunk, and told Heilmann that the ghetto would be cleared the next morning. 13 The men of 2nd Company, who were stationed in Mijayerzyk, were awakened around 5 a.m. They were joined by Drucker's 2nd Platoon from KOMAR 6WKA, as well as a sizable contingent of Huis. Drucker's men apparently cordoned off the ghetto while the Huis and the rest of the order police drove the Jews into the main square. Nade and others used their whips on the assembled Jews to enforce quiet. Some died from the beatings even before the march to the train station began. 14 Heilmann watched while the Jews, who had been incarcerated in the cellar prison of security police headquarters, were hauled out and led away. They were covered with excrement and obviously had not been fed in days. After the required number of Jews had been assembled, they were marched to the train station. Those who could not walk were shot on the spot, and the guards shot ruthlessly into the column of Jews whenever it slowed. 15 A small contingent of policemen was already at the train station in order to keep Polish spectators away. Nade supervised the loading of the arriving Jews onto the train. Shooting and beating were employed without restraint to maximize the number of Jews crammed into each cattle car. 22 years later, Nade's first sergeant made a very unusual confession, given the pronounced reluctance of the witnesses to criticize their former comrades. "To my regret, I must say that First Lieutenant Nade gave me the impression that the entire business afforded him a great deal of pleasure. 16. But even the most unfettered violence could not overcome the shortage of train cars, and when the doors were finally forced shut, about 150 Jews, mostly women and children but also some men, remained. Nade summoned Drucker and told him to take these Jews to the cemetery. At the cemetery entrance, the policeman chased away the eager spectators. 17. And waited until First Sergeant Ostman arrived in a truck with a supply of vodka for the shooters. Ostman turned to one of his men, who had hitherto avoided shooting, and chided him. "Drink up now, Pfeiffer. You're in for it this time, because the Jews must be shot. You've gotten yourself out of it so far, but now you must go to it." An execution squad of about 20 men was sent into the cemetery. The Jews were brought in groups of 20 men first, and then women and children. They were forced to lie face down near the cemetery wall, and then shot from behind in the neck. Each policeman fired 7 or 8 times. 18. At the cemetery gate, one Jew sprang at Drucker with a syringe, but was quickly subdued. The other Jews sat quietly awaiting their fate even after the shooting began. They were quite emaciated, and looked half-starved to death. One guard remembered 19. The number of victims of this massacres deportation of October 6 and a subsequent one 3 days later can not be ascertained. Witness accounts vary greatly. 20. In any case, the ghetto was restocked once again in mid-October, when 2,000 to 3,000 Jews were brought from Rajiri. These Jews were assembled early on the morning of October 14th, and loaded onto a caravan of more than 100 horse-drawn wagons. Guarded by Polish police, ethnic Germans of the Sonderdienst, and a few policemen from 1st Company, the caravan slowly made its way to Milgram, 29 kilometers to the north, arriving after dark. The empty wagons were then returned to Rajiri. 21. In subsequent actions, on October 27 and November 7, the Milgram ghetto was cleared of all but some 1,000 work Jews. These actions must have been smaller than those of early October, for neither Huey units nor security police from Rajiri were employed to assist the policemen. Nade was now totally in charge. He apparently introduced one further step in the deportation procedure, the strip search. After being assembled in the marketplace, the deportees were driven into 2 barracks, where they were forced to undress and searched for valuables. They were allowed to put only their underclothing back on, despite the cold autumn weather. Scantily clad, they were marched to the train station and packed into cattle cars destined for Treblinka. 22. With the conclusion of the November 7th action, units of Reserve Police Battalion 101 had deported at least 25,000 Jews from the city of human horror to Treblinka since late August. While Nade was deporting Jews from Milgram, 1st Company was carrying out parallel actions in LUK 6W. Captain Wolof was no longer in charge, however. His relations with Trapp had steadily deteriorated, and the Major spoke openly of his dismay over the Mijirzik episode, in which Wolof had taken his new bride to witness the ghetto clearing. 23. After the massacre at Sarakamla, Wolof had accompanied his wife to Hamburg, where he remained for several days before returning. Back in Rajiri by mid-October, he became ill with jaundice. In early November, his only brother, a Luftwaffe pilot, was killed, and several days later, his father died in Dresden. Wolof returned to Dresden for the funeral, reported sick, and returned once again to Hamburg for treatment of his jaundice as an outpatient. While recuperating, he learned that his request to be recalled from frontline duty, as the only surviving son, had been approved. He returned to Rajzin only briefly in January 1943 to pick up his personal belongings. 24. If Wolof had extricated himself from Reserve Police Battalion 101, his men enjoyed no similar respite. Joined by Steinmetz's men from Lomazy and Perchu 3rd Platoon, 2nd Company, as well as a unit of Huis, they carried out 2 deportations from LUK 6W of 5,000 and 2,000 on October 5 and 8. Memories of the deportations differed drastically. Some claimed that there had been only occasional shots and virtually no killing. 25 others remembered much shooting. 26 indeed, one policeman barely escaped being hit by a stray bullet. 27 The head of the Jewish Council, along with other prominent Jews, was killed at the assembly point the Schweinemarkt Y, or hog market, during the first deportation. Many who hid successfully during the first deportation were discovered and deported 3 days later. 28 The conclusion of one policeman, that the deportation from LUK 6W was decidedly more orderly and humane than the August deportation from Mijierzyk, reveals little, given the unmatched brutality of the latter. 29 After the initial deportations, Steinmetz's platoon returned to Pertu, and the battalion headquarters was shifted from Rajzin to LUK 6W. On November 6, Lieutenant Brand and Sergeant Jurek supervised the transfer to UK 6W of the last 700 Jews in Koch. When Jurek discovered that many Jews were missing, he shot the head of the Jewish Council on the spot. As in the transfer from Rajiri to Mijierzyk, horse-drawn wagons were used, and reached UK 6W only late at night. 30 The concluding deportation of the 3,000